Welcome to Mexico Centered. Today, we're talking about the flow of firearms across the United States-Mexico border, specifically how powerful weapons are smuggled into Mexico and add firepower to organized criminals in the country, making it difficult to control crime and violence. Our guests are Isabella D'Alacio, Senior Policy Associate of Voices for Progress, John Lindsay-Poland, co-founder of Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, and Gerardo Álvarez, investigator at México Unido contra la Delincuencia. This conversation explores the multifaceted nature of the issue, including America's entrenched gun culture, the challenges and opportunities for effective policy reform, and the current legislative and judicial efforts underway in both countries to curb illegal arms trafficking. We also talk about how gun trafficking is impacting both countries and how citizens and policymakers can be part of the solution. A note, since this conversation took place, the Supreme Court of the United States has dismissed Mexico's challenge to the gun industry in the U.S., a strategy which had been an important component of making the gun industry partly responsible for gun running into Mexico. I'm Tony Payan, Director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Mexico Centered. So let me just begin with the obvious question. John, perhaps you can introduce our listeners to the issue. What is exactly the problem with gun smuggling from the U.S. into Mexico? What are the dimensions of it? Why is it such a huge problem? For our listeners, give us a good landscape idea of what we're talking about today.
So the U.S. gun market in the United States is vast. It's unique in the world. It's extremely permissive. It's very militarized, and it's enormous. And in Mexico, there are issues of violence that are seeking those guns. So the gun trafficking problem is, the best estimate we've seen is more than 250,000 firearms that are smuggled from the United States into Mexico every single year. As a result, a gun that is purchased in the United States is as likely to be used in a homicide in Mexico as in a homicide within the United States itself. This has created enormous suffering within Mexico. In addition to homicides, there's also an epidemic of forced disappearances, most of which use firearms in the commission of those crimes, of extortion, of sexual violence, of migration trafficking. Firearms are critical for the drug industry, for the cartels that are smuggling fentanyl and other narcotics north. And all of this is also a result of the fact that the types of firearms that are available for retail purchase with very little restriction in the United States are the types of weapons that these criminal organizations are using in order to contest territory with each other, to contest with arms of the state, and to use against the civilian population within Mexico. And it goes beyond Mexico, of course, as well. It goes to Central America, it goes to the Caribbean countries and beyond. And so that's why this is more than just a domestic issue, as firearms are often seen within the United States. This is really an international issue.
Gerardo, let me ask you for a very specific thing for our listeners. Walk us through the life of a gun that originates in the United States, the different steps that it takes all the way until it's used in the perpetration of a crime in Mexico. Lead us through the various images as illustratively as you can so that we understand exactly what happens with a gun from the beginning to the end.
Yes, so John already has talked to us about the vast market of firearms in the US. So there are a lot of private companies that make a range of different kind of guns. Some are very popular between cartels in Mexico for specific purposes. These companies manufacture the firearm, then distributors in the US closer to the border are the most likely ones to sell these guns to individuals in the US. In the US, the regulatory system is very fragmented, so every state has its system. The issue related to the legal ability to consumers to buy it is constitutionally protected, so it's really easy to get a gun. And the easiest ways to engage in firearms illegal trafficking is through what is called straw purchaser, someone that makes up the front for somebody who is not allowed to buy a gun, being he or her has a criminal background or not the legal age to buy that gun. another kind of problems with the law. Then the guns get individually smuggled through a lot of different mechanisms. It's uncountable, no? Like the ways that the guns can get across the border in Mexico, and then the route to the specific destinations throughout Mexico. So that would be like a summary of the lifetime of a gun that starts in the US from the companies, the private companies, and then arrives in hands of criminals, cartel people, and all these issues that John has already talked to us about.
Isabella, do people in the United States understand that the gun smuggling issue can certainly result in more powerful organized criminals in Mexico that in turn engage in illicit activities that ends up in the United States through drugs in the streets, overdoses, and things like that? I think of it as kind of a circle, right? So we're providing the guns to criminals that at the end up affecting the lives of Americans again. How can we get the public to understand that such is the case?
I think that's a great question and a great point. I also do look at it like a cycle. I think we have big industries like the NRA and big actors who really lobby very hard to get in the way of any gun violence prevention measures. And they kind of create this demonization of immigrants in the same vein as well. So I remember specifically during 2020 when the pandemic started, there was this huge mass hysteria to buy more firearms to protect yourself from immigrants and things like that, and all of the really terrible right-wing rhetoric that is used to categorize these people. But the big misconception is a lot of people who are immigrants are people who are fleeing violence from US-sourced firearms. And I think that's very important, especially in this day, to lay out. So while we have this problem in the US, where we can't pass gun violence prevention laws, simple things like safe storage, which could help directly with gun trafficking, things like that, get in the way because people don't really understand the connections. So as you mentioned at the top of the call, part of my job is to bring survivors from Mexico to the United States to speak with legislators and tell them the issues that they're experiencing in Mexico, the way that violence is prevalent in their communities because of US sourced firearms. And we are still educating politicians. So that is one step that is being done. And I think it's very important in the conversations that we have with communities. I've had many moments where people put together that their, cousin or aunt was also immigrating from Mexico because of US sourced armed violence, and they didn't realize that those things connected. So the more that we meet with people in communities and talk about these issues, the more that we talk to our legislatures about these issues is a way that we can start having solutions. And so it's really about spaces like this where we can have this type of conversation.
So, John, what I see here is that this is a multi-actor chain. You got the politicians who can't pass legislation. You got the gun makers who take no responsibility. You got gun dealers, and then you got the straw purchasers, and then you got the customs agents, because I think Mexico probably, and talk to us about that, can't seem to stop the guns. So there's got to be a problem at the border in Mexico with the customs agents and what crosses into Mexico. And then in Mexico, you got the smugglers, the sellers, the buyers, the users. If you parse out the responsibility, is it even feasible to think that everyone can acknowledge their responsibility for the link, that particular link of the chain where they're situated to solve this issue?
Well, when I look at major social changes that have occurred, or policy changes that have occurred, typically not every actor involved recognizes and acts upon their responsibility. Like if you think about the civil rights movement, the Southern sheriffs who were fire hosing protesters didn't recognize their responsibility. It was the federal government that stepped in. And so I think it's also true in any complex and widespread social problem. You do have to have a critical mass. You have to have the right actors who are acting on their responsibility and responding to and taking action. So we are interested in affecting people's understanding. The narrative that is so dominant is that there's a problem of violent migrants, that guns are not the problem, that the border is the issue. And really, these are myths. And so we're trying to demystify those things. So, for example, you brought up the role of customs agents. Well, customs agents have also not been able to stop drugs from coming from south to north. Both countries, Mexico and the United States, have a very heavy investment in the volume of legal trade that is going in both directions over the border. And that volume is so vast that to try to stop these objects, which concentrate destructive power in a very small volume at the border only, is a very limited strategy. It's not that it shouldn't happen. There should be different types of devices that are seeking to detect. There should be inspections and so on. But our contention is that really we have to go further up the stream of what Gerardo described and begin to restrict certain types of production for the civilian market, as well as certain types of sales practices. That's, for example, what the government of Mexico's lawsuit seeks to do, is to try to govern and regulate certain types of marketing as well as production. A 50 caliber rifle, which can fire more than a mile away, it can penetrate armor, it can bring down a helicopter. There's practically no shooting ranges in the country where an ordinary person can practice with a 50 caliber rifle, should not be on the market for civilians. This is a type of measure that we think in market regulation could be most effective. That does require the will of a number of actors, but it doesn't necessarily require the will of all of them in that chain.
So, Isabella, the responsibility ultimately lies, I think, with politicians, legislators, and of course, law enforcement, a lot of bureaucrats involved, but not even the massacres that are common in the United States, and not even the statistics that clearly show that hundreds of thousands of lives are lost in the United States to guns and gun use, have actually moved our politicians. Do you think that it is politically feasible to move the needle right now, or are we in front of an almost intractable issue?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, well, first of all, after Uvalde, we did see the first ever bipartisan Safer Communities Act bill passed, the first gun violence prevention piece of legislation passed in 28 years. So I think it is possible to create change when we have a lot of voices present and really hoping for this change, calling their legislators, things like that. There are solutions on the federal level for these different pieces. There's the Stop Arming Cartels Act. There's also the Armas Act, which is going to be reintroduced soon. But there's also some Texas state legislation that is being introduced in the Texas legislature. So, for instance, there's a bill called SB 1385, which helps to deter gun trafficking by really cracking down on the criminal penalties for someone who engages in gun trafficking. And there's also another bill, it's called HB 2606. And this bill regulates assault weapons for people under the age of 21, which is also a really important way to help stop the flow. So it's important in border states to really pass these laws, but state laws in general I think are a really great place to start. And I think, it speaks to a greater issue of democracy in our country and the barriers to it currently. And so all of these kind of go together. These issues are intersectional, and we can create, paths to pass legislation. We can create ways for people to be able to engage and actually write legislation that helps these issues and pass them. So it's important to look at everything intersectionally and realize that one win is a win for another group as well. And I think those are great ways to start in educating your local and state legislators.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the states issue, California, Arizona, and Texas, and the role that they play. But before I do that, let me go back to the issue of culture versus institutions or laws and regulations and such. Gerardo, what I see is that Mexico itself is engaged in a process of militarizing its law enforcement, but apparently with very few, if any, results in dealing with the issue of guns domestically. The number of weapons confiscated, I think, continues to be only a fraction. In the United States, we obviously have a culture of guns. And I say culture because if you compare Canadians, apparently, for what I understand, may own more guns than Americans per capita. And yet we don't see the massacres in Canada that we see in the United States and Mexico. So is this going to help at all? Is the approach in Mexico to guns essentially going up the stream and filing a lawsuit? And I want to talk about that in a minute, John. And Isabella, you perhaps can enlighten us on that. How can we change the culture in both countries, and certainly in Mexico, when we see a response of fire with fire?
Yeah, so you touch a lot of issues that are important to the issue of violence in Mexico. The response to the dynamics of violence right now in Mexico are entirely militarized. That has a lot to do with the drug trade that also moves along the border. That has a lot to do with the guns that come south from the north. There's talk about a kind of arm race. The cartels are arming them up, so the military has to catch them up on the capacity of fire that they have. So there's a lot of entangled issues, and the topic that John already talked to us about, the legal commerce of firearms between two countries. But I represent an organization of civil society in Mexico. I think we acknowledge that the start point of the issue is the United States, the up of the stream, the companies, but we also acknowledge that there's certain responsibilities, no, in the Mexican authorities to have a better system for registration, have a better system to avoid the trafficking inside Mexico from legal guns that police have or general attorney's offices, right? So there's a lot of issues that have a lot to do with how Mexico deals with its geographic position, right? Because Mexico can say to the US, you have this responsibility, but Mexico also has to do what it has to do with its legal responsibilities, right?
Let me ask you, John, before we get to the States, one more question that I was thinking about as I was preparing for this podcast. The role of technology. Obviously, you mentioned that weapons today are considerably more powerful than they were in the past. Firepower, the rapidity with which they can certainly destroy a lot very quickly. And now we're talking about parts smuggling. You don't need to even smuggle the whole gun. All you have to do is smuggle one part at a time and then reassemble in Mexico. What do we know about the way technology is facilitating this illegal trade, which really ends up in a lot of deaths and destruction everywhere? Isabella, please.
Thank you. If I may, when it comes to changing the culture, I think that one really important piece is creating binational conversations and binational solutions. And we've done a really great job at that at Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico and Global Exchange. We've been working with the gun violence prevention movement in the United States. Specifically, Newtown Action Alliance is one of our great allies. And every year they host a national vigil for victims of gun violence. And we bring people from Mexico there to share their stories and to talk about those things. And people from America who are survivors, really find solidarity. And I think it's a really beautiful way to change the culture is to make sure that we have these conversations together. So I think creating these binational conversations, but also not just having these conversations, but working together to create solutions that work for both of us, because you cannot do one thing in the United States that doesn't affect Mexico. So it's so important that we create these agendas together.
Thank you. John, the technology component of it.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Partly it's tough because we don't even have very good data on parts smuggling. A lot of the contemporary, like the most popular long gun in the United States right now is an AR-15. And the AR-15 is an assault rifle, right? It can do an enormous amount of destruction in a short period of time. The bullet, when it enters the body, it tumbles. It's likely to create a lot more tissue destruction inside the body than a simple .22 caliber pistol bullet. And that particular weapon is like a Lego, it's like mix and match, very easy the way it's been produced. So that facilitates smuggling of parts that are then able to be reassembled in Mexico. So we need better data on parts smuggling. And I would say we need changes in both culture and policy, because there needs to be political will in policy. There needs to be guidelines, regulation, penalties where appropriate, restrictions on production, restrictions on marketing, and so on. But I think there's a responsibility within communities to say, well, actually, we don't want to arm the cartels. Even people who are pro-gun generally are not in favor of arming Mexican drug cartels. So if that is true, then what is our community doing in order to stop that from happening? And I think that's a question that communities and community members need to ask ourselves. How are we preventing this from happening? Because the way the market is structured right now, whether it's the technology and the interchangeability of different parts that make it easier to smuggle them, or whether it's the ease with which you can buy something in a gun show or in a private sale, or whether it's the proliferation of extremely militarized weapons for the consumer market, there's nothing to stop that trafficking. And I would say one other thing, which is that when a firearm or its parts is purchased and is transported towards the U.S.-Mexico border, it is legal unless it's been transferred from a straw purchaser to someone else. It's legal until it gets to the border, until it crosses the border. Only when it crosses the border does it become illegal, which creates an enforcement challenge. That's, again, why we say we need to regulate the industry further upstream, so that not all efforts have to be concentrated at a border where it's very difficult to stop things that are going over in such volume.
So go back, Isabella, to the issue of the states. I looked at some of the maps and the dots in Texas and Houston, but I think there was also some references to California and Arizona. And I read somewhere that the number of per capita gun shops in border counties far exceeds the gun shops that may exist in a county in the interior of the United States. That should signal that there is a demand market for these guns. And also the question, if you can address it at once, of who smuggles guns. I'll tell you why I asked that question, because when I was at the University of Texas, El Paso, and I was a professor there, I had a student who acknowledged to me that he paid his tuition by taking guns into Juarez. And he got in legal trouble, eventually got probation. But it was a very open acknowledgement that that was the case. And so what about the border market and the smugglers? Because as far as I can tell, as with many other activities on the border, they're really U.S. citizens. They're not Mexican citizens. Talk to us about that border issue, that border demography and landscape, and who's really doing the smuggling.
Yeah, I actually would love to defer to John for this question because he uncovered a lot of this great information in our Iron River report. So John, please take it away.
So what we saw in tracing data for firearms that were recovered in Mexico and traced to a purchase in the United States is that there is a very high concentration of purchases of guns that are then trafficked in border state cities. So Houston, Tucson, Phoenix, a lot in California, but most of the guns in California that were purchased and then trafficked to Mexico stayed on the secondary market for a long time. So the time between the purchase and when they were actually recovered in Mexico is a much higher average of 6, 7, 8 years.
Why is that?
That's because the guns are not purchased to traffic. So if a gun is purchased and it shows up 10 years later at a crime scene, chances are that when it was purchased, the purpose was not to traffic it somewhere else. But it stays on the secondary market, which could be in the United States or it could be in Mexico. But a lot of times it's in the U.S. Whereas in Arizona and Texas, there's a much shorter, what we call time to crime, between the purchase and when it's recovered. Now, there is a very high concentration of licensed gun dealers in a number of border cities. So Yuma, Arizona, Brownsville, Texas, El Paso, Texas, some of these other very tiny border towns like El Rio, Texas. And as you say, there is a strong market demand in those places. And it's clear that that demand is primarily for Mexico, where you would think that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms would increase the number of inspections to ensure that there are not practices that facilitate trafficking. So the border states in general, and especially Texas and Arizona, have both a very large number of firearms dealers. They have strong gun cultures in both states and are also targets for trafficking. Now, who is doing the trafficking? Yes, it is primarily U.S. citizens, because those are the people who are legally authorized to purchase and to own a gun within the United States. A non-U.S. national is not going to be able to do that legally. One other thing I would add is that the restrictions at the border from north to south are much less than the restrictions from south to north. Again, the narrative is that from south to north, you have drugs, you have rapists, you have violent migrants, you have, these terrible people who are coming over the border from the south. And from the north, well, we're the good guys, so nothing could be going from north to south that is a problem.
Except that there's money and guns.
Except that there is money and guns. And so all of the technology, the border agents, the rules, it is all built primarily around what is coming from the south to the north and not what is going from the north to the south. And that self-conception that we're the good guys limits the ability and the will to enforce any kind of southbound gun trafficking issue. Rules.
So what's the market like, Gerardo, for guns in Mexico? Who can buy weapons? Under what conditions? What permits? Who regulates that? Are all the guns from the United States? Are there other countries that supply guns? Give us a little bit of the gun landscape in Mexico overall, and a little bit of what the government's efforts are to control that, who regulates it, and what happens to a gun when it is confiscated.
Yeah, so in Mexico, we have something in our constitution that it's very similar to the U.S. Second Amendment. We have a right to bear arms, but in the same constitutional article, it says that Congress has the ability to regulate this right. So we have a federal system for all 32 states of firearms control that is very strict. So legally, a Mexican citizen can only purchase small calibers, like 9 millimeters, and that's it. So it's very limited, the kind of guns that can be legally owned by civilians in Mexico. So that's the legal part of it. This issue, like what happens with it, is that we have a huge illegal market that we already talked about it a lot. I think it's the whole issue, the widespread indiscriminate availability of guns, that a majority of them comes from the US, but there's a lot of other countries that also could supply this availability. There's a record of firearms that come from other countries, mainly Europe, because there are a lot of companies that have headquarters there, like Beretta or Glock in Austria. So it's not entirely a U.S. thing, but it mainly is. The problem entirely is this illicit market, and there could be a lot of ways to get a hold of these firearms. Right now, they're researching a lot the role of social media to get a gun, like in Facebook groups or TikTok. It's interesting to see all these dynamics of armament that is illegal. So that's the problem. And then following up your other question, your last question about what happens with a gun that is secured by the armed forces, there's a lot that could happen to that kind of firearm, that it's confiscated by authorities. It could be destroyed. It could be reappropriated by the armed forces if it has some utility, some value. There's this issue that happens a lot with arms confiscated to drug lords, or this kind of valuable arms that are currently in Sedena's museum. Sedena is our military secretariat, the federal government. So there's a lot of ways that...
But I also read, Gerardo, that some of these weapons are stolen even after confiscation, and they end up back out. So somebody takes them and resells them. Am I correct? Is that kind of corruption as well?
We have this problem that this issue has to do with registration, with appropriate treatment of evidence, and with the capacities, the state capacities of the authorities to deal with these artifacts in a safe and right way, without corruption, without dealing with all of this kind of stuff. The ability of the authorities to fiscalize and oversight the workers, the civil servants that do these confiscations.
Yeah.
So, yes, there's this problem about legal weapons or not legal, but that are already in the authorities' hands, but go back to the same cycle of illegal markets.
I would say about that point that
yes.
I personally have not seen documentation of weapons that were confiscated by the authorities going back into the illegal market.
I think what I read, John, was that military weapons sometimes are lost.
Yes, police weapons in particular.
Yeah. And they don't know where they end up, but surely.
So there's a record of at least 10,000 firearms that were either lost or stolen from police.
Right.
And I have also heard accounts of weapons that are confiscated that are then used by police or military. And they might be used as a dirty weapon to commit a crime, but not necessarily circulated back out again.
Yeah, I think it shows how multidimensional this issue really is. A very quick question before I get into the lawsuits, because we're going to run out of time very quickly. You mentioned that Italy, Israel, Germany, the Czech Republic, and Belgium are also weapons sources for Mexican crime. Do we have any percentages in terms of their origin? Or some of them may be Israeli weapons that come into the U.S. and then end up in Mexico anyway. So can it be traced?
So I was referring to weapons that are imported legally into Mexico and used by Mexican military or police forces. So the U.S. is the largest supplier of legal firearms for the legal market within Mexico, again, primarily military and police. But Israel is also a significant supplier. And again, these tend to be more assault rifles or heavier weapons. Same with Belgium. Italy, the Beretta is a major supplier of handguns to the legal market in Mexico. Yeah, we do have some numbers that where the United States is approximately 39% of the legal market, and then the other countries represent smaller amounts within that, Italy being the largest.
So, Isabella, Mexico has determined that its strategy is going to be to go all the way up to the source. And they chose to file a lawsuit in Massachusetts against gun manufacturers. And then more recently, not long after actually, to file a lawsuit against gun distributors in Arizona. Why would Mexico choose that strategy? Is it smart? Has it paid off? What's the status of these lawsuits? Where are we? I know the Supreme Court just heard one of the cases in this year, and I guess we'll hear the results of that case in the summer coming up, really almost imminently, perhaps in June next month. Tell us a little bit about that strategy and where we are with that.
Yeah, so we actually just hosted an oral arguments listening party for Mexico versus Smith & Wesson, the Supreme Court case that was just heard. And the main argument is that these gun manufacturers are aiding and abetting in the transfer and sale to cartels. I think it is a good strategy to take it through the courts. And that's because it's important to really attack it from the source. So gun manufacturers know who they're marketing to. We had a panelist speak on the fact of that gun manufacturers have been seen marketing to Proud Boys, to children even in California. They passed laws against that recently. But they really do know who their market is, and they're really showing off the latest weapons and technologies that would be used in these crimes. And so it's important to try to target the source, but at the same time, we see that they're trying to really separate themselves from the gun dealers and be like, well, we don't know what the gun dealers are doing. We don't know who they're selling to. So I think a main strategy that really needs to be thought upon more is kind of creating that connection between the manufacturers and the dealers, but also who they are marketing mainly. John, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, John, the Supreme Court in the hearing appeared skeptical. What do you think?
Oh, I think the Supreme Court is likely to dismiss the suit. And the primary reason is that the gun industry in 2005 achieved federal legislation that guards the industry against litigation when their actions, their marketing, their design of the weapons, their practices for distribution have contributed to violence, whether that's within the United States or outside the borders. And that legislation, which is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLACA, is probably what will be cited. It's what was cited by the defendants in the case, and it probably will be cited by the Supreme Court. On the other hand, the lawsuit in Arizona against the 5 gun dealers whose weapons were trafficked, many hundreds of weapons trafficked over the border into Mexico, has proceeded much further. It's in the discovery phase or the evidence production phase. And that could be extremely helpful because we will see from that discovery materials what is going on within the industry. How are the manufacturers and distributors as well as the dealers, how are they running their business in ways that have facilitated this trafficking? I also think that both lawsuits have been very important in improving the understanding of people within the United States that the issues of violence in Mexico are, first of all, beyond Mexican problems. They're not just Mexican problems. There's no doubt that Mexico has problems that are contributing to the violence there, but they are also problems that the United States contributes to. And not only at the level of a straw purchaser or a dealer or what happens at the border, but in the overall gun industry and the way the gun industry operates. We share these problems. The problems of mass mass shootings at schools and in other public places in the United States are in common with the problems of organized crime that is massively killing and disappearing people in Mexico. It's coming from the same source of an unregulated and extremely militarized industry. And I think that understanding has been really highlighted by these lawsuits, regardless of what the judicial outcome is.
I really want to thank you, John. Hopefully we'll have you at the Baker Institute sometime in the fall to discuss this issue a lot more. And Isabella, I want to thank you too for joining us today. And Gerardo, thank you so much. I really want to thank our guests today for enlightening us about the gun smuggling to Mexico from the United States, and of course the whole chain of responsibility and where we are right now with the lawsuits. The Judy Leigh Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico binational relationship through policy research and solutions, and by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Leigh Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the center. This episode was produced by Albi Delgado with support from Karina Zimel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more. And thanks for listening.